The concept of resilience appears in a lot of different scholarship and research, and it can mean a lot of different things. So one of the things we were trying to do in this volume, and one of the things that I try to do at the start of my chapter, is clarify what this concept means. And generally, people think of resilience along two dimensions, maybe a static set of capacities and then a more dynamic, adaptive set of capacities. So static capacities, generally you want to think about the conditions, properties, or attributes, say, of a city or another community that might lead them to be more successful in overcoming adversity or some kind of crisis, whether it's a natural crisis or a man-made crisis. In this particular volume, we're looking at man-made crises, waves of violence and crime. And then the adaptive, more dynamic capacities are things that allow those communities to use those more static properties, like wealth, in a very creative or innovative way. So that's where maybe the level of education in a community might play into their more dynamic, adaptive ability to use the static resource of wealth.
Well, I think it really depends on where you are. There are parts of Mexico that are very much like you would expect to see in any kind of very highly developed, ordered part of the world. But there are pockets of Mexico that function, we really don't know exactly what's going on inside because there's limited information coming out sometimes. The people that are in control of those areas are also in control of the information. And so it's really a little bit of a mixed bag.
In my own research, it's education and regional economic development. And education matters very locally for communities. So there is no sort of neighborhood or spillover effect from education. Education can be a policy that is promoted very locally, even at isolated or individual municipalities, say in Mexico, or individual communities. Economic development matters as well. But in my own research, I find that economic development is a policy that needs to be targeted at wider regions, at groups of relevantly connected municipalities or other communities.
Right. In many places, the media really don't have the liberty to report openly on the most important stories that are happening in that particular region, either because they feel threatened and therefore self-censor, or they've simply left. In fact, one of the things that's happened is that the number of students who are interested in studying journalism and becoming professional journalists has declined in the last 7 to 8 years, so that some journalism programs have even closed. And this is obviously going to have a huge implication for the future when Mexico needs journalists to report on information. The fact that self-censorship is so widespread in exactly those areas where the information needs to come out, has huge implications for overall freedom of expression in Mexico. And of course, we know that for a democracy to function in a healthy sort of manner, citizens have to have access to information. They have to be able to use that information to hold their elected officials accountable. And if they're not getting that information, or if people are afraid to disseminate information, that's going to have an overall negative impact on society. I wish I had the answer to that. Again, I think some of it does really depend geographically on the geographic area that you're talking about. Up until this time, Mexico City, for example, has been really rather sheltered from the explosions in violence that you see, for example, along the border region or in Michoacan and Guerrero and some of these other places. So for them, the issue doesn't seem as pressing. It's more intellectual. It hasn't hit home yet. If you talk to people who are living in those areas, we'd like to think that they're closer to the tipping point. I mean, certainly that one argument for what's happening in Michoacan with the self-defense groups is that they've reached that tipping point. The problem is that they've taken measures that are not in keeping with our sort of democratic understanding of what civil society should do, right? They're trying to perform the functions of the state in lieu of the state rather than working with the state to find a joint solution to the problem.
At least longitudinally, sort of looking at the trend in violence over the last 10, 15 years, I think we want to get back to at least the levels of violence that we saw in 2007. A more optimistic answer would be at least a flattening or a downward trend in violence, and we saw that in 2012 and 13. 2011 is basically where the level of violence peaked, where there was this upward trend. I still would say that though we have broken that upward trend and violence looks like it's started to go back down, it's still incredibly high. So I'd like to return somewhere close to 2007, if not somewhere closer to the mid-late 90s.